Al, I want to speak with you a little bit about the legacy of Christopher Columbus and especially the political dimensions of that. I always enjoy speaking with you along this line. You bring such a vast knowledge to it all, but also sort of a willingness to put it in terms that we can understand. I'm interested in the situation in Europe at the time of the Columbus's voyage, 1492. So we're looking at the 15th century and how things developed. And I just direct your attention to the rise of the nation state. We had, in Spain itself, we had the various kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, coming together and giving us the beginnings of a nation state. And I think without that, we couldn't really envision these explorations happening. It's though Europe it had to gather itself to get a sense of nationalism, even a competitive kind of spirit among the nation states, and then say, now we have to go out and find ways to enrich ourselves. You have to make a path to the Orient, and this leads to Columbus and the discovery of the New World. And even when I use that word discovery, I have to be a little bit careful in using that word, because some people would say, well, what is this idea of discovery, since the Indians were already here and well knew it was here, and they didn't need to be discovered. So we have to find another word. Some people have talked about the collision of two cultures, or the encounter of two cultures, but we have to find a more neutral phrase rather than, I think, discovery as the way of talking about all this. So I've raised a lot of different questions there, but if I can direct you back to the political situation in Europe at the time.
Well, to get to the question of terminology first, I guess I'll be very direct about it. I think the most accurate description of what happened is to call it the invasion of America. Some people are offended by that, but the truth of the matter is that what occurs between 1492 and the ensuing centuries was an occupation by European powers of the New World and the subjugation of its peoples.
Through military
I don't
means.
think there is any other way to describe that than to say that it was essentially an invasion. It was certainly not a discovery in the sense that you found new and unoccupied land, and encounter implies a certain relationship of reciprocity and equality that was certainly not characteristic of what happened. Another possible term is collision. But I think if you want to describe outcomes, it's an invasion, it's a conquest. Mm-hmm. Curiously enough, the Spaniards who first set off the process made no bones about it. They called it the conquista, the conquest.
Right.
But now somehow we don't quite want to use that terminology.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point you made about the rise of the nation state, though, is an
well, let's stay. Let me stay with this other thing.
Okay.
As long as you wanted to expand on it, that is how we even talk about it, what framework we put it in. The various religious groups have tried to figure this out, in having a 500th celebration of all this, the quincentennial of whatever we're going to call this happening in 1492, have tried to adopt different postures. I know the National Council of Churches, for example, in the United States, really has taken quite a repentant attitude in their statements. They have said, this is wrong. It was the enslavement of a people. There were Christians involved in this. It was not the right thing to do. We decimated a people. It's genocide. They even talk about ecocide. In other words, it started out messing up this continent and land of ours that the Indians had so carefully preserved for so many centuries, etc. So the National Council of Churches take a very repentant attitude. Catholic bishops, I think, have also included that in their statements, but have seen it in a more positive light, I suppose, as setting off a new period of evangelization, true evangelization that would not be forcing the faith on other people and would be an attempt to, as some have said, re-evangelize and make sure that the people living here now have some sense of what the Christian message is all about. So the churches have struggled with how to term this, how to react to it, and so on. And I think that, your very strong, forthright statement that this is a conquest then would lead, it seems to me, to a lot of talk of repentance, that this isn't right, and Christian people really should not have done that, although we might be able to understand it in historical context. That is, Catholic Spain was very interested in evangelizing and missionizing and spreading the faith and in converting these Indians. So maybe understandable, but still, from a historical viewpoint, it ends up being a conquest and a lot of repentance needed.
Well, I guess I have a problem with both the position of the National Council of Churches and the position of the Catholic bishops
Let's
on
hear
this.
that.
And I think my difficulty with it is this. I think we need to be very honest about what happened. In the course of that honest assessment, I think we need to admit that in every event of this sort, there is a balance sheet. There were some very bad things that happened as a result of the contact between and invasion of America. Some things that are kind of, could very well possibly lead to repentance. But not every European who came over here was necessarily a villain. And I don't buy into this myth of the noble savage either. I think what we need to do is try to assess essentially what happened in all of its complexity before we start making judgments about it. And I guess then when we come back to it, I think that there is one point that we do need to make. And maybe this leads to repentance, maybe it leads to something else. It is a sort of admission that our own myth or fairy tale about what happened isn't exactly true. It wasn't a simple process of bringing light to savages. The continent was not discovered. It wasn't empty. The old mythology we have about the whole frontier process is basically flawed. And how do you set that right? I guess what you do is deal as analytically as you can with what happened.
Well, let's try to do that then, Al. I mean, I agree with that, and I think the mythology is widespread. I mean, there would be people, both in terms of the noble savage that was discovered here, these people lived in an idyllic state, etc., and also the wild beast imagery, which was popular not only in Spain, but I guess especially in England, that these people were cannibals, that they couldn't be trusted, that they were inferior, less than human. All of that sort of thing became part of the dominant mythology, and that we came here and converted these people, that is, we being European Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, came and converted these people and helped to save them from this cannibalism and so on. So, I mean, that there really is a popular myth that way, and we need to overcome that by looking at a lot of different angles along this line.
Let me get back to my problem with the religious statements
Please.
On this subject, because I don't think I quite made the point I wanted to make. I agree that there is much which we probably need to look at and say, well, although we ourselves didn't personally do it, we probably ought to, in some sense, deplore what our forebears did. In that sense, the National Council of Churches is right. When I come to the statement of the Catholic bishops on the matter,
it's called Hope and Heritage,
yes.
I think.
When they talk about evangelization, I guess at that point, I think we need to know more objectively about how some of those mission communities really operated. Because there's a tremendous problem, which historians have, in assessing that. And I think what we'll probably come down to is, finally, is to say that in some cases they were well managed, the process was humane, respect was shown for the dignity of the individual Indian and what have you. In other cases, I have to say, there's evidence, however well intentioned, of a terrible kind of repression, of an almost brutal insensitivity.
Yeah. Did you see
to
that
Indian
movie,
culture.
The Mission?
No, I didn't. I'm afraid I didn't.
I was going to ask you about the historical accuracy or how you checked it, but I mean, it was a terrible indictment in many ways of the ferocious side, the slave trading side of the Spanish conquest of the Indian civilization. Incidentally, that document by the Catholic bishops, Al, is called Heritage and Hope Evangelization in America.
Yeah.
And they try to take, I think, a balanced viewpoint. I mean, they're trying to say things like, yes, we admit that these bad things happened and genocide, or I don't know if they use that word, but that's surely the enslavement of these people. Well, and on the other hand, that the evangelization, the bringing of the faith to these people did open up new ideas, perspectives to the Native Americans. I think they try to see an ambivalence about it, but their thrust then is to move beyond it and say, well, let's think of a new evangelization.
Yes,
now.
exactly. And here's a point I want to make. I was absolutely astounded by that statement in one point. Probably I shouldn't have been, because there's a very explicit admission in that statement. I think the word is that the Indians who settled America walked with God, and that their religion contained within it certain bits of divine insight.
Right.
Now, that implies an approach to the whole matter of dealing with Indian culture that very few Spaniards or Englishmen or Frenchmen in the early contact period could conceivably have understood. Bartolomé Las Casas was sort of inching in that direction in a pragmatic way. Some of the Jesuits in New France were practicing a kind of toleration for pragmatic ends. But the point that needs to be made is the great flaw in the evangelical efforts of Catholics and Protestants alike in the 16th and 17th century, and for that matter all the way into the 19th and early 20th century, is the tendency to confuse Western civilization with Christianity, and to assume essentially that there is nothing at all redeeming or worthy in Indian culture. And that meant, in effect, that in order to make a Christian of an Indian, you had to eliminate his Indian aspects. Now, again, I think we need more very close analysis of how some of these missionaries' operations really worked. Some of them were very repressive, some of them almost sadistic in their efforts to save by eliminating Indian elements. Others were not. And I think that from an historian's point of view, trying to get a handle on that is very important. My own research has pretty much focused on New England and the New England Puritans. And I can tell you that their missionary efforts were woeful because of their absolute inability to respect anything in Indian culture, or for that matter, to embrace the Indian convert as an equal after the Indian had renounced his former ways. The pattern is more positive elsewhere. And I think that if we're going to analyze how the process operated, we have to move away from this tendency to stereotype or dichotomize and say, well, it's either good because we're bringing these people to Christ, or it's bad because we're imposing their values upon it. I think that before you can make sophisticated value judgments, you have to step back and engage in some hard-headed analysis that for a period of time is morally value-free and neutral in order to get the data you need. And so I guess the thing that bothers me about the current discussion that's going on about the process is that, on the one hand, it's the old game of self-flagellation, oh, how evil our forebears were, mea culpa, and on the other hand, it's, oh, well, we weren't all that bad. I don't think either approach really gets at it.
And you, as an historian, want to make sure we have the facts and have a nuanced view of how these missionary efforts really worked and how this at least collision of two cultures worked itself out. One of the things that would be important to see in all this from a theological viewpoint is that the statements of the bishop that God walked with the Indian people is something that's consonant with the Second Vatican Council, and it was only with the Second Vatican Council that we got a lot of explicit statements looking at other religious traditions and saying these traditions are vehicles of truth and goodness, that the grace can be found within these religions. And it was only out of that sort of mindset that the bishops could end up writing, which I think is quite a fine document here, in which they were able to see the positive value within Indian religious culture.
One of the problems I have in my own teaching of this material is in getting students to understand that 16th and 17th century Christianity, whether you're talking about Catholicism or one of its many Protestant versions, isn't the same thing as late 20th century Christianity. There was an intolerance, almost a brutality in the Christian belief of an earlier period. And the fact that it's not present now doesn't mean that it led to very real tragedies then. And I guess the word I would use in terms of the Christian-Indian encounter is that I suspect in many cases it was tragic.
Certainly from the viewpoint of the Indians it was. There's no doubt about that. Al, do you think we should get back to this political dimension that we were going to?
Well, we have wandered a little far apart. Although I guess I would observe that the separation between the political and the religious realm, which we take for granted, is certainly not present in the 16th century.
Certainly not present either in Europe or in the Indian world. I think that's absolutely crucial, and I think it is important to set the stage for any discussion, whether you're talking economics, politics, social matters, or whatever, to have clear how you think of the overall fact of what happened in the 15th, 16th century here. When we look at Europe from a political viewpoint, I think I started to indicate this founding of the nation states, which is a very important part of all this. Maybe we could go back and see if you want to elaborate on this. My image was that Europe had to gather itself, and as it did gather itself into nation states, it needed to look outward for economic reasons, and therefore you made possible the age of discovery, or the age of exploration. I should clean up my language there. Age of exploration, and then a collision with other cultures or conquest of other cultures. So let's look at that nation-state question, maybe.
Well, I think that, even if Columbus or someone like him had 2 centuries before managed to touch on the New World, there's a lot of speculation that someone might have, and the Vikings did, it would have led to absolutely nothing, because there was not present the social organization and machinery to exploit that. It's the process of consolidation of power in Europe, the crisis of the old feudal order, the emergence of the nation-state, the economic needs of the nation-state, and above all else, the rise of a merchant class, a transformation in economic values that makes making a profit now the thing to do. A couple of centuries before, there was a certain stigma attached to mercantile activity in Christian Europe. I think that those changes were absolutely essential to making it possible, the exploitation. By the same token, I think one reason why the New World was so easily occupied is that the Indians were at a much simpler stage of political evolution and didn't have the kind of cohesive state organizations that could resist.
That's one reason that the Spaniards were able to effect this conquest. Figures are standing in my mind about Cortez and conquering the Mesoamerican civilizations with 600 people when they had millions. Is that true?
That's exactly right. One of two things happened. They were either dealing with people that had no state organizations at all, as in were simply organized in village kinship societies, or they were dealing with states that were not really fully integrated. And the Aztecs were a good case in point. The Aztecs were highly urbanized, but the problem was that they were not. There was a great deal of disunity, and one reason for Cortez's triumph was, quite apart from his exploitation of the superstitions of the Aztec ruler Montezuma, he was able very astutely to exploit the antagonisms of one Mesoamerican city-state against the other. And so a more accurate account of how the Spanish took Mexico would say that Cortez, aided by his Indian mistress and interpreter, was able to rally Indian opposition to the Aztecs and prevail through the process of divide and conquer. In other areas where there was less urbanization and even less of a state, you simply had so much rivalry among highly individualized village bands and quasi-tribes that it was very easy for Europeans to play one off against the other. And the Indians were by no means innocent bystanders in that. Indian sachems who wanted to attain prominence would think that one way to do it is essentially to make an alliance with these Europeans with our marvelous weapons and gain power and prominence that way.
Al, the question of the numbers we're dealing with here, I know it's highly debated and so on, but I wonder if we could just give some general figures so we have some sense of the number of Native Americans that were found in the New World when Columbus came and when Cortez succeeded in his conquest and so on. I mean, there is one sort of myth that the continents were just very sparsely populated with a few tribes here and there, and they managed to move them out, so on. And I think the other factor is the great demographic diminution that occurred during this time.
I don't think anybody can give an accurate figure as to what the total population in North and South America would have been. For years and years, we were misled by the projections of an anthropologist named Mooney, who took census accounts taken several years or several decades after first contact and extrapolated them across the continent and came to very, very low figures. The problem is that immediately after contact, epidemic diseases brought by Europeans, to which the Indians had no immunity at all, simply decimated the population. Well, decimated is the wrong word. Decimated implies reduced by 10. The total reduction of population was in the range of 90% over 2 or 3 generations. So you now get population figures for, let's say, just the United States. Mooney would have specified a figure around 1 million. It was at least 10 to 20 times that much. For the population of all of North and South America, a good guess would probably be around 100 million. In any case, there were areas in the New World, such as Mesoamerica, that is Mexico and Central America, that were as densely populated as Europe. There are other areas where the population is sparser, but it's far higher than was once believed.
So we're dealing with continents that are quite heavily populated, that are organized into various tribes. You do not have a lot of centralization,
That's
therefore
right.
they cannot mount a defense against the European invaders. The Europeans used a divide and conquer kind of approach to overcome them. What can we say about anything else about that we know about the organization of these tribal societies? My impression again is that there were certain wise people who were important within the tribes and that conserved the traditions, and that it almost has more of a feel of a democratic kind of approach, doesn't it? And even where women were involved at times in the decision-making process.
There's a lot of variation. Of course, there is no such thing as a single Indian culture. There are many, many hundreds of different Indian societies, but in North America there are some commonalities, and I think you've identified what some of them were. First of all, I think it's a profound mistake to think that these were people without history. They were pre-literate for the most part. There's some limited evidences of literacy in Mesoamerica, but nowhere else. But they were able to record, by one device or another, and commit to memory, some very, very detailed tribal mythologies, which essentially define their place in the cosmos. And some of that literature is unbelievably rich, and some of it is quite beautiful. In terms of their own particular social structures, they tended to be egalitarian. Now, generally speaking, the greater the population concentration, and the greater the reliance on horticulture, the greater the tendency toward a stratified society. And you will find societies like the Mississippian, which is highly stratified and rather repressive, but that is the exception. For the most part, American Indian societies tended to be fairly egalitarian. They tended to operate on the basis of consensus. The Indian leader generally ruled through the power of persuasion, and in many of those societies, the women played a much more important and vital role than they did in European society. Iroquoian societies, for example, were not exactly matriarchies in the sense that the women ruled directly, but the women were the head of the clans and had the power to designate the males who carried on overtly the role of government, and they possessed a sort of veto power. They would stand around during the council sessions and what have you. They wouldn't participate in the debates, but if they didn't like the course that things were going, they would simply change officers. A lot of these societies are matrilineal.
Now, one of the things that strikes me about this is the great tragedy that the Europeans who came over here were not open to generally learning from the political and familial structures that they found here. In other words, there was a lot in the Indian culture that Europeans could have benefited from, even the role of women, which appeared to be they appear to be better off here in the New World than they were in Europe, and sort of some of these democratic notions and decentralization. There was a lot to be learned, and it's a tragedy that they weren't open to it. Of course, they weren't open to it because they thought these people didn't know anything, that they were primitives, and eventually that they were cannibals, and all one could do is either convert them or kill them, which seemed to be the kind of outlook that many people had. So when we start to think of the legacy of Columbus in this political era dimension of all of it, it seems as though Europe didn't do so well. They got a lot economically, but I'm not so sure what Europe learned politically at all from an encounter with the Indian cultures.
Well, the Europeans, and this is pretty uniform, you're talking about the English or the Spanish or the French, managed to devise a certain myth of their own to the effect that the Indians were all under the thraldom of the devil, and that the real struggle that was going on here was between the devil and Christ. And if you describe a society essentially as diabolical, you don't have to analyze it, you just denounce it. Even Roger Williams, who was very enlightened and very perceptive on a lot of matters, he's a dissident Puritan preacher in New England who's exiled in part because of his Indian sympathies. He provides a lot of very good data about Indian culture, but when it comes to Indian religion, he says, I'm not going to look too closely at this, because this is devil worship, and I'm not going to put my soul in jeopardy. And so he made all sorts of very fundamental mistakes in his analysis of Indian religiosity, because he assumed in an a priori way that he was dealing with devil worshippers. And that is remarkably ubiquitous. There are very few people in the 16th and 17th century who understand anything else among Europeans.
And then, as you well point out, if you start out with that mindset, you're not going to learn anything from them at all, either religiously or politically. Well, we've tried to look at the political dimension of the legacy of Columbus, and we've seen the rise of the nation-state in Europe, which made it all possible. We see the decentralized approach here in the New World, which made them very open and good targets for the Europeans. And we see not a lot of dialogue or a lot of improvement politically on either side, it seems.